So I'm going to introduce him now. Thank you, Jed, for doing this. I really appreciate it. And let's take it away.
I'm only wearing this hat because I forgot I even owned it. I found it in my closet last week. I bought it at Colonel Bubby's surplus store in Galveston, Texas. Anyway, I wanted to show you that. But thank you everybody for coming. I'm always amazed that people are interested to hear about Lincoln. Margaret always wants me to do a program in February around his birthday, but I'm in Arizona. So she still persuades me to do a program even though it's later in the year. But I do appreciate your coming. First slide I have, of course, is a picture of Abraham Lincoln, the one that's on a $5 bill. First of all, I want to say that the U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, under the presidential powers, designates the president as the Commander-in-Chief of Army and Navy of the U.S. and militia of the several states when called into active service of the United States. Of course, he was elected president in 1860, November. Many in the North opposed any idea of war. Before he was ever inaugurated or took the oath of office, he had 7 states secede before March of 1861. Then February was Texas. After that, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee. They all seceded, some of them after his inauguration. He was inaugurated in March of 1861. There were pickets on the rooftops as the war on states had seceded and the war was imminent. Standing army at that time was about 16,000 men, you can imagine. By the end of the war, it was over 1 million under arms. On April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was fired on. And that was the beginning of the war. Lincoln then called for 75,000 volunteers. One of his generals, later generals, William Sherman, said, you might as well use a water pistol to put out a fire in a house with 75,000 men. This will be a long war and you'll need a lot more men. Turned out he was really correct. Most of the officers for the Civil War, both sides, were graduates of West Point Academy. About 80% of them were from the South, because that's what you did when you were a gentleman of leisure and in chivalry. You went to West Point. That was a big problem for Lincoln. In fact, there were 60 major battles in the war, and every one of them was led by a graduate of West Point, either north or south. 294 of those officers served the U.S., 151 served the Confederacy. 105 of them were killed in action. When they graduated from West Point, they took an oath that was almost the same as the one the president takes when he's inaugurated. I'll read that oath for those officers, because it is significant. I do here solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I'm about to enter, so help me God. I read that because I recently read a book called Robert E. Lee and Me. A fellow that grew up in Virginia and revered Robert E. Lee like most presidents of Virginia. At the end of the book he concluded, really, he was a traitor. And all those officers that came from West Point that went to the Confederacy were traitors, when you think about it. So, interesting perspective. When Lincoln became president, he had no military experience except he'd been in the militia in Illinois in the Black Hawk War. But he studied war strategy. He got books in the Library of Congress incessantly. He was deeply involved in strategy as the Secretary of State. Historians have given him high praise for his strategy and his development in day-to-day military operations, as well as his ability to select and encourage commanders. There are some exceptions to that, because some of them he selected didn't turn out so well. And for example, people that he suggested. I have to change the slide here, I hope I can do it right. Carson, what's happening?
Oh, hold on.
The first general we're going to start with is this guy, Robert E. Lee. Why Robert E. Lee? Well, because at that time he was one of the premier generals or colonels and officers of the United States Army. He graduated second in his class at West Point with no demerits. Interestingly, the person that graduated first in that class was a man by the name of Charles Mason. Charles Mason was an Iowan. He moved to Iowa and he became the first Chief Justice of the Territorial Court of Iowa. When Iowa became a state, he became the first Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court. And he was a general from that graduating class. He set the record for the score there. He later became the Commissioner of Patents in Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee was the son of Light Horse Harry Lee from the Revolutionary War. He was married to the great-granddaughter of George Washington. His home was in Arlington. You may have heard of it. It's now Arlington Cemetery. It was the Custis Lee Mansion that the U.S. government confiscated during the war. Later on, after decades and decades, the family got paid by the U.S. government. I mentioned he was second in his class at West Point. Guess who was the third, still today holds the record? Charles Mason first, Robert E. Lee second. The third person in rank and in scores at West Point is Douglas MacArthur. Still holds that record today. Most of the officers at West Point were engineers. Interestingly about Robert E. Lee, he was the owner of slaves. He had around 100 slaves that he inherited. His wife inherited most of them. But he called slavery a moral and political evil. At the end of the war, he was promised and he was going to free his slaves anyway. Originally, he was in the cavalry when the time of secession started. He was the chief aide to General Scott in the Mexican War. He served there with a guy by the name of U.S. Grant. By order of the President Buchanan at that time, he was ordered to go to Harper's Ferry, and he was the colonel that captured John Brown, which I think is interesting. His lieutenant was a fellow by the name of Robert Anderson, who became a captain and a colonel, and he was in charge of Fort Sumter when it surrendered. To me, interesting trivia tidbits. He was promoted to colonel by Lincoln. 3 weeks later, he was promoted to general. And I gave you that officer's quote. At the recommendation of General Scott, he was called to the White House to visit with Lincoln and offered the command of the Army of the United States. At that time, Virginia had had a vote about secession and had voted not to secede. So he wasn't sure what to do. He met then with Lincoln and also General Scott. Went home to think about it. Here's what he said about secession. As an American citizen, I would defend any state in her right if her rights were invaded. But I can anticipate no greater calamity for the country than dissolution of the Union. I'm willing to sacrifice everything but honor for its preservation. Secession is nothing but revolution. Imagine that coming from a guy who ended up being a principal general. It was intended, the Constitution intended for perpetual union, and it can only be dissolved by revolution. So he resigned his commission on April 20, 1861, and moved south. And of course, you know his success he had was really a loss to the U.S. And had generally wonderful successes until Gettysburg, which was a battle that he lost, although tremendous casualties on both sides. And he barely escaped. the Union General, General Meade, didn't chase him down because they had so many casualties, almost 100,000 casualties between the two at Gettysburg. But he was like Lincoln, he hoped that there would be reunification. But at the same time, he did not oppose or did not favor equality, and he did not oppose the Ku Klux Klan. Interestingly, after the war, he made a trip to the White House to visit President Grant. On the other side, I've included this because at the time, the Major General and General of the Army for the U.S. was General Winfield Scott. He was called the Grand Old Man of the Army. He was a Mexican war hero and a very competent general. He was also known as Old Fuss and Feathers. He insisted on a strict military protocol, saluting and all that stuff. He had battles in, he became a general in 1814. He was a lawyer, also an engineer. He fought battles in Canada, and mainly lots of Indian battles. He became the General of the Army in 1841 and turned out to be the longest surviving active general in the United States. There's a picture of him in about 1860 or 61. He was removed one time from command by President Polk, but reinstated. He clashed with him and also with the Secretary of War at that time, back before the Civil War. Guess who the Secretary of War was at that time? A man by the name of Jefferson Davis, who became president of the Confederacy. Lincoln asked him to secure the city at his first inauguration, and Scott's response was this: "I shall consider myself responsible for his safety. If necessary, I will plant cannons at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue." That's how dangerous and tense it was at the time of inauguration. He advised Lincoln to appoint Robert E. Lee as the premier general or officer in the Army. But instead he got Irwin McDowell because McDowell was close to Scott, and Scott was, at this time, was old and feeble. He couldn't even mount a horse. At this time he weighed about 330 pounds. He became pretty ineffective, although he remained in office. In 1882, after the war, he was visited by Grant at West Point for 5 hours. Scott had written his memoirs, and Grant had written his or was writing his, and they exchanged memoirs. And what Scott said to Grant was, "From the oldest general to the greatest general." That's the esteemed kid for Grant. And the historians labeled Scott as one of the most accomplished generals between Jackson and the Civil War, one of the most accomplished in the history of the country. But, unfortunately, he was sidelined by our next general, a man who was a boy general, very famous for a number of different reasons. Unfortunately, he was a poor choice. General George B. McClellan. His dad was a surgeon. He was born in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. He entered West Point at age 15. Graduated at age 19. He was also second in his class at West Point. He was an engineer. He also studied law. He was in the Mexican War. He was somewhat a protege of Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War at that time. But he had a tendency for insubordination. That's an understatement. He was sent to the Crimea to study war in Russia. He spoke French. He wrote a book on tactics. He wrote a book on cavalry. He invented a saddle that they used in the military and cavalry for years. He supported, in 1860, before the war started, he supported Stephen A. Douglas against Abraham Lincoln. He was opposed to abolition and emancipation. His main attribute was that he was a friend of Salmon Chase, who was Secretary of Treasury for Lincoln. because they were both in Ohio. He was appointed a major general, and so he had a rank only second to what Winfield Scott had, and was assigned to the Army of the Potomac. And he bragged about, I'm now the man of the hour, and newspapers picked up on that, and he was the man of the hour. But one thing he did, he was very good at discipline, very good at organization. He was put in defense of the city of Washington, D.C. He built about 46 forts around the city, and kept asking for more and more men. He disdained volunteers. You know, Lincoln had called for 75,000 volunteers. They didn't like volunteers, but he took them. And he got that army of the Potomac built up to 168,000 men. And finally, eventually, up to 190,000 men just for that army surrounding and supporting Washington, D.C. He wanted another 80,000 men. He wanted 273,000 men. He always believed he was outmanned, outgunned, and outmanned. But he was great at discipline, great at organization, and worked with his men in that regard. But to give an example of his problem and his insubordination, one of the dumb things he did was he wrote to his wife about everything and about everything he felt. And his wife preserved his letters, which she shouldn't have done. Because here's one of the first letters he wrote after he took command. The president is no more than a well-meaning baboon. I went to the White House. I found the original gorilla about as intelligent as ever. What a specimen to be at the head of our affairs now. This is the commanding general that you have to deal with. And again, after he was appointed, he wrote his wife and said, I found myself in a new and strange position. The President, Cabinet, General Scott are all deferring to me. I seem to have become the power of the land. He went on to say, I could even be a dictator, but I'm not going to be a dictator. That's the guy Lincoln had to deal with. And there's another example. For example, the Battle of Bull Run. He wasn't in charge, but he was in charge of the second Battle of Bull Run. He argued that it was difficult to win because the Confederates had 150,000 men against his 160,000. In actuality, the Confederates had about 35,000 or 40,000 men. That was standard for him to over-exaggerate his opponents. Once before he'd been in office very long, Lincoln and Secretary of War Stanton went to visit him at his house. The general was out for dinner, so they waited in the parlor. He came home from dinner, marched through the house upstairs. They waited and waited. Finally, an aide came down and said, well, the general's retired. That's the relationship they had. Lincoln, in his magnificent and magnanimous way, said, well, let's not stand up to what we They gave him many, many chances. The biggest thing that happened with McClellan was Lincoln pushed him to attack the Confederates after Bull Run. Richmond's only 100 miles away. He had 190,000 men. Go get them, go to Richmond, take Richmond. He pushed him, wrote his letters, wrote memos, wrote orders. He dilly-dallied, wouldn't do it. Once Lincoln wrote to him again and said, here's a plan I think would work, use this, do this. McClellan wrote back, but not to Lincoln, he wrote back to the Secretary of War Stanton, 22 pages of why he couldn't do that and refused. Finally, after waiting all the winter, he finally made his move to go up the peninsula, called the Peninsula Campaign to Richmond. But he waited so long, and through the winter, when he got there, the Confederates were all gone. So it was a complete disaster. You had to turn around and come back and move all those 190,000 men back. Lincoln said to him, I will gladly yield my plan to yours if victory is certain, if you break the lines of communication and make retreat for them difficult. Again, he sent that 22 pages later and said, I will stake my reputation on the result. His reputation suffered greatly. By the time he got there, they were all gone. And then he said about General Scott, who was his boss, still his boss, General Scott is the obstacle. He's either a traitor or an incompetent. Imagine writing that about your boss in the military. But that sums him up pretty well. About that Peninsula Campaign, what Lincoln said about McClellan was, you know, if McClellan isn't using the Army, I'd like to borrow it for a while. And the other great quote was, when they're talking about his lack of ability and aggressiveness, if he'll fight, I'll hold his horse for him. He was also the general at Antietam, where he kept a large body of men in reserve rather than using them. And he wrote to his wife and said, I feel I have twice saved the country. The battle was a masterpiece of art. Turns out at that point it was the largest loss of life in the entire Civil War. But he thought it was a masterpiece. In August of 1862, Stanton and Chase and almost the whole cabinet, Lincoln's cabinet, recommended immediate removal, saying it's not safe to entrust McClellan with the command of any army. Imagine that guy second in his class at West Point, great skills as an engineer. Here's what John Hay, who was a secretary, one of Lincoln's secretaries, said. The president was in deep distress. He had trusted McClellan with the defense of Washington, D.C. He was almost ready to hang himself. He was manifestly alarmed for the safety of the city. Here's a guy with 193,000 soldiers under his command. But that's the assessment. Interesting, he got removed a couple times, shunted off to a remote post. He resigned. And in 1864, guess what he did then? He ran as a candidate for the Radical Democratic Party against Abraham Lincoln. He was on the ballot until he realized that their platform called for compromise, war, let slavery continue to exist, and he withdrew from the race. Later, he was elected the governor of New Jersey. Here's what historians have said about George McClellan. In decisive battles, his headquarters were too far to the rear to allow his personal control of the battle. He made no use of his cavalry forces. He did not share his overall battle plans with corps commanders. He was willing to accept cautious advice about saving his reserves. The New York Evening Post said this in his obituary: probably no soldier who did so little fighting has ever had his qualities of commander so minutely, and we may add fiercely, discussed. McClellan is usually ranked in the lowest tier of Civil War generals. Great start. And part of my point is, this is what Lincoln had to put up with as the commander-in-chief. He wasn't a soldier. He hadn't served except in the militia, and he had to deal with people like this that thought they knew more than he did. But Lincoln's mind was such a, he had lots of lines from the Library of Congress, and he became a great strategist. Like he said one time, it takes a long time to scratch something on my mind, but once it's there, it's hard to rub it out. So he was as competent as many of his generals in terms of strategy and tactics. Doris Kearns Goodwin, historian, here's what she wrote about McClellan. McClellan so frankly exposed his own weaknesses. His personal correspondence to his wife, generally, reveals a tendency for self-aggrandizement and unwarranted self-congratulations. Pretty much sums up George B. McClellan. Next person I'd like to talk about is a picture of Lincoln and McClellan meeting. There's his formal portrait. This one. Anybody recognize that guy?
Grant?
You ever heard of Camp Dodge? Fort Dodge? Fort Dodge, Iowa? Dodge City Camp? One of Iowa's premier generals. They only had 3 in the Civil War. Grenville Dodge. And he was a great general. He was born in Massachusetts, had a degree in civil engineering. He moved to Council Bluffs, where he became a surveyor for the Union Pacific Railroad and a banker. Interestingly, he and Lincoln had a history. In 1859, before the election, Lincoln made a trip to Kansas, went up to Council Bluffs, Iowa to meet with people and talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, which was a big topic at that time. He spent 3 days in Council Bluffs meeting with this man because they said, this is who you need to talk to, is General Dodge. So they spent about 3 days together, and as he said, Lincoln peppered him with questions about the Transcontinental Railroad. He traveled to the Republican Convention in Chicago in 1860. He was appointed in 1861, Lincoln appointed him a colonel of the 4th Iowa Infantry. He fought at and was wounded at Pea Ridge, Arkansas. Then he was appointed Brigadier General. I'll also point out that a lot of people were appointed generals temporarily in the war. They call them brigadiers generally, or brevet temporary officer, usually battlefield promotion. There were a lot of those. But then U.S. Grant, who was a commander, made him a commander of the division, which is the Army of Tennessee. His main skill, because he was an engineer and a railroad man, excuse me, was repairing railroads. And he became so good at that Grant relied on him a lot. But his other claim to fame was that he became the main intelligence officer for Grant. This is something I didn't know about. It's called the Corps of Scouts. It has been called the pioneer of military intelligence. Later, Grant said to him, you have much more important command than any other division in my army. He was with Grant at Vicksburg. He's with Sherman on the march to Atlanta. He retired to Council Bluffs, but before he retired, Lincoln called him to Washington to discuss again the Transcontinental Railroad in 1863. Again, asked General Dodge to find and fix a place for the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad. And of course, he decided and selected Council Bluffs, Iowa, and that's where it started. In 1862, Lincoln signed the Railroad Enabling Act, so it started at Council Bluffs. Another interesting thing, and I can go back, I think. Another Iowa general who fought with and worked with Grenville Dodge was Samuel Curtis from Iowa. And he's listed by one writer as one of the 4 Union generals that were better than any of the famous others. Samuel Curtis from Iowa, actually from Keokuk, moved to Council Bluffs, helped General Dodge build the railroad, extend the railroad, and when he died, he was buried back in Keokuk. But he was an unsung hero, but a famous general nevertheless. The next one I want to talk about is another problem for Lincoln. John C. Fremont. Anybody know who he was? He was called the Great Pathfinder. Explorer, military officer, politician. He was born in Georgia as an illegitimate child of a Frenchman and a woman that lived there. He was a first-rate topographer, map maker. He bought land in California because he'd been assigned to California, and he coined the phrase Golden Gate. Beginning in 1842, he led 5 expeditions to the west, mainly the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, in Mexico, Salt Lake, Tahoe. He has 24 plants named after him, 13 towns named after him, and 4 counties across the country, including Fremont, Iowa, and Fremont County, Iowa, county seat of Sydney. He was appointed in 1847, he was appointed the military governor of California, especially about the time gold was discovered. Became very wealthy, $1 million or $10 million or more. He was elected to the Senate in California, it became a state. He was interestingly, people I don't think know this, but the Republican Party was formed in 1856. He was their first candidate for president on the Republican ticket. Didn't win, he lost to Buchanan. But his campaign slogan was, free soil, free men, and Fremont. When the war started, he was in Europe, came back, was appointed. Basically, all the expeditions he made were paid by his father-in-law, Thomas Hart Benton. But he was appointed to general and sent to the West Division, which was everything west of the Mississippi River, which basically meant Missouri and Arkansas. It's a border state, really right on the edge of seceding. Lincoln and his cabinet and his people worked real hard to keep it from seceding and becoming part of the Confederacy. Unfortunately, General Fremont acted like a European bureaucrat. He declared martial law against anybody's advice or permission. If you were favoring the Confederates and talked about Confederates or bore arms for them, his order was you would be shot. Then he entered his own Emancipation Proclamation for the state of Missouri. All the slaves in Missouri are free. Lincoln said, we're going to have to withdraw his foolish proclamation. Asked him to do so, sending a letter of caution and not censure. Asked him to withdraw his Emancipation Proclamation, and he refused. Well, guess what happened? He was removed from command. Also at that same time, he had awarded contracts to all his friends. So he had a tremendous amount of fraud and stupendous contracts that were outrageous. So they didn't court-martial him or remove him, but they sent him to a different place, usually, I think, the Mountain Division. But the problem was that he gave rise to a lot of rebellion in Missouri. Cantrell's raiders and people like that were true secessionists. It was a real job to keep Missouri in the Union. When he sent to the Mountain Division, he refused to serve with another General Pope, typical of his history. He finally resigned. As historians have said, he lacked discipline, isolated himself from subordinates, again and ran against Lincoln. He bought the Southwest Pacific Railroad after the war, missed the payments, and his fortune was wiped out, became destitute. President Hayes, after that, appointed him to be the governor of the Arizona Territory. Typical, he never showed up. So they removed him or resigned. Finally, he was appointed in 1890 as a major general just because he was destitute and his wife needed a pension. Everybody know this guy? I want to include him just because he's interesting. General George Armstrong Custer. There he is in full regalia.
An idiot.
Well, interesting. I found interesting things about him. You see his uniform, I don't know if that's the same one, but basically he wore a black or a purple velvet jacket. Just affectation. And a red scarf around his neck. The reason for that is so his men would see him and know where he was in battles. And a big floppy hat. He was born in Ohio. His nickname was Audie as a child. He entered West Point in 1861, just about the time the war was starting. He had 726 demerits. Within about 30 demerits of being kicked out. He was last in his class. But he was on a speedy track because of the war, so they kept him in, let him graduate. And he always tested the boundaries, not a serious student. He had a low grade in cavalry tactics and maneuvers. But guess what? They put him in charge of cavalry. And he got in action right away. But here's the interesting thing. I didn't know until I did this. He was involved in a lot of battles and fairly successful. He was at the first Bull Run, which was a disaster for the Union because they had few men, untreated or untrained men, and an incompetent general. So he was at Bull Run. Then he was in the Peninsula Campaign that failed under McClellan. Then he was at Antietam. At that point, the deadliest battle in the war. Other generals wanted aggressive officers, so at age 23, he was made a general. The general was battlefield temporary promotion. Again, he wore that gaudy uniform. He wanted his men to see him and recognize him. He was at Gettysburg. I didn't know that. And he played a fairly crucial role at Gettysburg. He interrupted Jeb Stuart's cavalry. And he only had 2,700 troops to Confederate 6,000. He lost 257 men there. It was the highest loss of the cavalry at Gettysburg. Then he went with General Sheridan to the Shenandoah Valley. Then he pursued Robert E. Lee to Appomattox and blocked his retreat, received a flag of truce, and demanded the surrender of General Longstreet from the Confederacy. He was present at the surrender at Appomattox. Think about all these places he's been because of his aggression and his activity. Interesting thing about Appomattox, the table on which the surrender was signed by Grant and Lee, General Sheridan bought it after the war and donated it to his wife, Custer's wife. It's now in the Smithsonian Institution. So he was pretty well received and esteemed at that time. He was appointed a major general at age 25. And after the war, he was posted to Louisiana and chief of the cavalry. But he was unpopular with his troops at that point because they thought him was vain and a dandy, which you can imagine with the uniform he wore. He was out for a while. He toured the South after the war with President Grant. He felt kindly towards the Southern people. But he's back in the Army in 1866 as a lieutenant colonel to the 7th Cavalry, headquartered at Fort Riley, Kansas. Another example of his rashness, when he was stationed there, actually they were in either Montana or Wyoming, but he was stationed at Fort Riley, Kansas. He missed his wife, so he took off to go visit his wife without permission. AWOL. So he didn't get court-martialed, but he got suspended for a year because of that act. I don't know why he didn't get court-martialed, but he didn't. But he was arrested and then had a leave of absence. Then he led his troops to the Black Hills because they discovered gold there. That was part of his duty. He met his fate, of course, at Little Bighorn. He had 600 men. He didn't listen to the advice of his people, his subordinates, waiting for reserves. They ignored his advice and tactic. People always say he was really aggressive, but I say it borders on foolishness and foolhardiness. 600 men versus 3,500 Indians. So the outcome was pretty predictable. He's buried at West Point. Interesting. So really, he had an interesting history until the end. Did I know him? Oops, wrong one.
Sherman.
General William Tecumseh Sherman. Soldiers called him Tum. Tecumseh is an Indian chief. in, I think, Nebraska or Kansas. Very famous Indian chief, several books written. I've read a book about Tecumseh, but he hated that name. He was probably the most brilliant of all the Civil War generals. And really, I think got a bad rap because of the Atlanta campaign. But I have to read a quote. He was beset by hallucinations and unreasonable fears, and finally contemplating suicide. He had to be relieved from command in Kentucky. As a man, Sherman was an eccentric mixture of strength and weakness. He was impatient, often irritable, depressed, petulant, headstrong, and unreasonably gruff. He had solid soldierly qualities. His men swore by him, and most of his fellow officers admired him. He was a foster child when he was 9 years old. He had a number of siblings who became very well known, very famous. One was a judge, another was a founder of the Republican Party, one was a congressman, one was a senator. Hoyt Sherman of Des Moines was one of his brothers, banker, businessman. Major generals in his family, and one ambassador to a foreign country. So quite a family, and he fit right in. He started West Point at age 16. But he wasn't ambitious to be an officer, so he was always a private in the Corps at West Point. But he was sixth in his class. Historians called him one of the brightest. He fought in Florida and they removed the Seminole Indian. He called that a great pity. He was married to a lady named Ellen Ewing, and at his, because of his family connections, at his wedding, present was President Zachary Taylor and future President George Filmer. He resigned the Army in 1853 and went to San Francisco, became a banker, kept the bank solvent, moved to New York to run a branch there, kept it solvent, also Leavenworth, Kansas. By 1859, he was the superintendent of the Louisiana State Seminary, now called LSU. He was adamantly opposed to secession. Here's what he said about secession. And he resigned from LSU, or the seminary. Here's what he said. You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood. You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. The North can make steam engines, locomotives, railroad cars. Hardly a yard of cloth or a pair of shoes can you make. You are bound to fail. At first you will make headway, but your cause will begin to wane. And that's how he felt about secession. So he resigned the position, went to Washington, met with Lincoln. He was made a colonel. He was also at Bull Run, that very first Bull Run, which was a disaster for the Union, only a few miles from Washington. People drove their buggies and wagons and horses out to go watch it. It was a picnic. They were going to watch the fun. It turned into complete chaos and disaster because the rebels outgunned them, outmanned them. The only bright point in that whole Bull Run episode was William Sherman, because he organized the people into a halfway reasonable retreat. He was appointed, this is what one historian said, it was one of the few exemplary performances. He was appointed brigadier general, sent to Kentucky, but he asked to be relieved because he felt he was unfit for duty. And that's when he had his breakdown episode. He was gone for several months, sent to Ohio to recover. Then he returned to Kentucky under Grant. But here's what he said about that episode. One newspaper complained about him and the Army, and this is what the newspaper said. The Army is being ruined under the leadership of a drunkard, Grant, and whose confidential advisor, Sherman, was a lunatic. That's a great statement about two generals. Great general. What Sherman said in response was, General Grant is a great general, I know him well. He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now, sir, we stand by each other always. After he returned, he had a battle at Shiloh where he was wounded twice, praised by Grant. He was also at Vicksburg with Grant when they had a siege of Vicksburg. Made a major general at that time. He was the head of the Army of Tennessee when they began their march to Atlanta. And history is probably still divided about that. What I've read, it indicates that mostly it was property damage. His orders were to destroy government facilities or factories that were supporting the war, to leave private property alone. There was little loss of life. He called it a strategy of hard war, what he called maneuver war, shock, disruption, surprise, an indirect approach. He forbid looting. He was called a brilliant strategist and the first modern general. He made the first surrender in North Carolina with Joe Johnson. He's the one that issued an order in Georgia about 40,000 freedmen, ex-slaves, 40 acres and a mule. That was after the war, and President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, rescinded his order. He was sent to the Indian Wars, retired to New York, and people pushed him to run for president after Grant. And here's what he said: "I will not accept if nominated and will not serve if I'm elected." He's buried in St. Louis. President Benjamin Harrison said this about Sherman: "He was an ideal soldier. He cherished the institutions formed by the Constitution." One of his followers at his funeral was Joe Johnson, Confederate general. The esteem that his colleagues had for him. General Sheridan, I don't have much to say about him except he was a colleague of Sherman's, also on the march to Atlanta. Similar qualifications, similar brilliant general. Same guy. This is Hiram Ulysses Grant. That was his given name. Actually, they drew names out of a hat to name him. And that's what his name was Hiram. He went by Ulysses though most of his childhood. His grandfather fought at Bunker Hill. He got his name, U.S. Grant, at West Point, standing for Uncle Sam, because he was active. When he entered West Point in 1843, he was age 17. I'm just amazed at how young these guys were that entered West Point. He was 5'2". He weighed 117 pounds. There's hope for you yet, Rick. You could have played guard on your football team. Anyway, he grew to be 5'7" by the time he graduated. He was a great horseman in the equestrian realm. He set records that held for 25 years at West Point. But guess what? When he graduated, he didn't sign him to the cavalry. He was an infantryman, a private, or a lieutenant, instead of being in the cavalry. He served under Zachary Taylor and Scott. He served in Louisiana and Mexico. He felt the Mexican War was unjust. He felt slavery was unjust. He served in California and Oregon. He resigned in 1852, mainly because he really was drinking at that time and missed his wife being gone from her. He was age 32 at the time. Interestingly enough, even his wife had a slave. His father-in-law had an 850-acre plantation enslaved. He resigned from the army and farmed for a while, released his one slave, even though he was very poor and couldn't afford any help. That was in 1859. 1860, he moved to Galena, Illinois. For all order of that, that's where his home is. But he worked for his father, not very successfully. He didn't vote in the election of 1860 because at that time, if you weren't a former resident and meet the residency requirements of Illinois, you could not vote, so he wasn't able to vote. After 1860, after Lincoln's election, he enlisted quickly. He requested a rank, and guess who denied him in the rank? George B. McClellan. He fought at the Battle of Shiloh, which also was a very, very gruesome battle. He lost 13,746 men. Got lots of bad press by the newspapers. The Confederates lost 10,000 men in that battle. But here's what Lincoln said when he was criticized. Lincoln said, "I can't spare this man, he fights." And they say, "Well, he drinks." Lincoln said, "Well, find out what he drinks and send him a barrel." Interesting, at that battle at Shiloh, which was a terrible battle, a man by the name of Samuel B. Todd was killed, brother of Mary Todd Lincoln. But she had a split family, some of her people served the Confederacy. One of the generals in that battle was also General Wallace. General Wallace wrote a famous book, and nobody's been heard. The general in the Civil War. Grant then became the commander at the Army of Tennessee. He had the siege at Vicksburg, which was really a turning point in the war, at the same time as Gettysburg. So 7 week siege at Vicksburg, and finally won. It was a crucial win. Only time he and Lincoln didn't get along or didn't see eye to eye was Grant issued an order called Order Number 11, expelling all Jews from the area where he was serving. Lincoln said, no, you can't do that. I understand you have black marketers and you have people following your army and vendors taking advantage of the troops. And it's okay to ban those vendors, whether Jews or otherwise, but you can't just ban one race or one religion. So that's the only time that really had a conflict. In 1864, in March, he was made the Major General, commander of all the Union forces, 533,000 troops. Here's what Lincoln said about Grant. "You are ever vigilant and self-reliant. I am pleased with all of this, and I wish not to obtrude or constraints or make any restraints on you." Grant wrote back and said, I've never had any cause for complaint from you. Everything you've asked, I have yielded. Also, Lincoln wrote this to him: "Nothing I have done or shall do is to delay or hinder or interfere with you in your work." That's how much Lincoln thought of him. Another interesting thing about this time, at the end of 1864, he wrote to Grant, and wanted to have his son Robert be in the Army. "Can you find a place for him in your staff? I'll pay for it." And here's what he said, which I think is tremendously telling. "I ask you not as president, but only as a friend." Think about that, president writing that to the general. That's how close they were. They met weekly towards the end of the war. Lincoln and Stanton, the Secretary of War. He was in big battles after Vicksburg, Nashville, Petersburg. At the end, this is what Grant said about the war: "The Southern cause was one of the worst for which people ever fought." In terms of surrender, he worked out with Lincoln, Admiral Farragut, Stanton, so that the Confederate soldiers could be on parole, keep their horses, and he ordered all the U.S. troops not to celebrate. He attended the cabinet meeting on April 14, 1865, the day before Lincoln was shot. Lincoln invited he and his wife Julia to attend the theater the next night with the Ford's Theater. And he begged off for a couple of reasons. One, I think they had a child that visited at school in North. Plus, his wife Julia hated Mary Todd Lincoln. They couldn't be in the same room together. So, otherwise, he would have been perhaps with Lincoln tonight at Ford's Theater. Later, Grant said, Lincoln was the best man I have ever known. After the war, he resisted any criminal charges against Robert E. Lee. He was made the General of the Army, outranked by George Washington. He visited the South with President Johnson. In 1868, he was a unanimous choice for president. He won 52% of the popular vote. At that time, he was the youngest president, age 46. He was an effective civil rights president. He created the Department of Justice, who signed Civil Rights Law of 1875, which the Supreme Court later found unconstitutional. He signed a law for Yellowstone National Park. He tried to help the Indians. Unfortunately, he was not a great administrator. He had bad friends and bad advice, and his administration was tainted by the Teapot Dome scandal, which was a horrible ending for him. He ended up being destitute. He was writing his memoirs. He had throat cancer, was dying, and his wife were barely surviving. Mark Twain entered the picture and said, "I'll print your memoirs." And he did, and it saved him and his family, because they got lots of royalties after that. Because Grant died very soon after that. I mentioned earlier there were 4 generals that were more famous than the famous ones. I mentioned Samuel Curtis. Another one was Nathan Kimball from Indiana. August Willich, who was a Prussian general, came to the United States. The last one was George H. Thomas, the most underrated of all the generals in the war. He was the only one undefeated, never lost a battle. He was from Virginia. The problem was Lincoln didn't trust him because he was from Virginia. He was called the Rock of Chickamauga, soldier, soldier. He burned all his notes, never wrote memoirs, but one of the most successful generals of the war. I want to finish by reading something, and some of you heard some of these things before, paraphrases. Here's what General Sherman said. I want to show you another slide. Here's what Abraham Lincoln looked like when he was elected in 1860. Here's what he looks like 5 years later. Commander in Chief. But here's what Sherman said about war. You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. You cannot have peace in a division of our country. If the United States submits to a division now, it will not stop. It will go on until we reach eternal war. I want peace, and believe it can only be reached through union and war. I confess without shame, I am sick and tired of fighting. Its glory is all moonshine. Even success, the most brilliant, is over dead and mangled bodies. With the anguish and lamentations of distant families, it's only those who have never heard a shot, never heard the shriek and groans of the wounded and lacerated, that cry aloud for more blood, more vengeance, and more desolation. There's many a boy here today who looks on war as all glory. But boys, it is all hell. Pretty profound statement from a really successful and intelligent military general. Thank you all. Questions?
This isn't about the war, but I had coffee with a veteran who was on the last freedom fighter war he did. And I asked him how he found those names on that freedom wall. So he went through the process of doing that, and then we got talking about Arlington Cemetery. And he said it's full. We can have no more burials there. Anybody else heard that?
I hadn't heard that.
Well, they're trying to buy more ground.
What?
They are trying to purchase more ground for expansion of Arlington. And that's also why they're encouraging like the Iowa Cemetery down at Iowa Veterans Cemetery to take the pressure off of Arlington.
Well, for some time, it was only officers that could be buried there, including the last 20 years or so.
A bit of my family's history, my Aunt Maggie Naylor, who was the sister of Nathan Bardot, my grandfather. She was born in April of 1865. The week she was born, Lincoln was shot and the Civil War was over.
Well, I have a paper, someone in Scranton, one of my clients gave me a paper, the New York Times or Herald, dated April 16, 1865. It's not in very good shape. That's the one.
Explain how the Union used the Custis Lee mansion grounds when they confiscated it.
Of course, Lee, when he resigned and moved south, moved to Virginia, left, I don't know, I assume he abandoned his house, the Custis Lee Mansion. And after Bull Run, the United States government was looking for a place to bury dead soldiers, so they started burying them on his lawn, on his property. And that was his estate, that was his property. And they turned it into a cemetery from that point on. I didn't know until recently that decades later, maybe 30, 40 years later, his heirs made claim and the U.S. paid something for that land. It's a beautiful facility if you've never been there. Other people that are buried that are famous, I didn't know George Armstrong Custer was there. Also Robert Lincoln, Lincoln's only surviving son, was ambassador to England, Secretary of War, president of the Pullman Railroad Company. He's not buried in Springfield with all the rest of the Lincolns. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery. Basically pretty anonymous. Well, I hope you enjoyed talking about that.
As far as Sherman's edict that they should get 40 acres and a mule, right near the villages there's a community called Royal, and it is the only place surviving where that 40 acres and a mule still exists. The slaves from a plantation across the river decided they're going to fight to implement that thing, and the plantation across the river decided to let them have that land. And they divided it up 40 acres per family and the mule, and to this day they still have those 40 acres intact, and it's quite a trick at the present time to keep it that way because it is being encroached by the villages, this growing metropolis of retirement.
So this will be Florida.
In Florida, Royal, Florida. And so they are the leader of this group that is trying to keep the thing together, is really has a difficult time keeping some of these families from selling this 40 acres because they are very, and you know, they got to turn down a lot of money to keep this thing together. It's a very interesting place. Give tours and have a museum, and Lois and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you. Any other questions? Don't forget to look at the baby buggies. It's our temporary exhibit. And a lot of these baby buggies are hidden in the back room that you don't get to see them. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.